August 7th, 1942. The first American amphibious offensive of the Second World War unfolds across the beaches of Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida Island. Under a hard South Pacific sun, Marines splash ashore through chest-deep surf, while Japanese lookouts scramble to radio Rabaul. The U.S. Navy's carriers hover uneasily to the east, knowing that land-based Japanese bombers can reach them in hours. In the churn of surf, palms, and smoke, one of the most consequential experiments in modern air combat is about to be tested, not by its inventor, but by men who have only read about it, discussed it in ready rooms, and trusted that the logic of geometry might be enough to offset the Zero's mystique. That experiment was the Thach weave. John S. Jimmy. Thach was not in appearance the type of man around whom myth accreted. A compact Arkansan with precise manners and a gunnery instructor's obsession with detail, he had spent much of the pre-war Navy puzzling over equations of lead, deflection, and ballistics. The Japanese Zero had not yet been revealed to the world when he began sketching on memo pads at his kitchen table in 1941, sliding matchsticks to represent airplanes. But reports from China, and later from the Pearl Harbor raids, suggested that America's standard fighter, the Grumman F4F Wildcat, would be at a severe disadvantage against a lighter, more agile opponent. The Wildcat was slow to climb, reluctant in the turn, and burdened by its weight. The Zero, in contrast, seemed to violate physics, a paper-light airframe, no armour, no self-sealing tanks, but breathtaking manoeuvrability. How could an inferior machine survive an encounter with an enemy that could outturn and outclimb it at will? Thach's answer was deceptively simple: teamwork as weapon. Two fighters would fly side by side, slightly offset. If an enemy latched onto the tail of one, both would turn toward each other. The attacker had to choose: press the pursuit and fly straight into the crossing fire of the other American, or break away and lose position. In classroom tests, it was elegant. In practice, no one knew. The test came on June 4, 1942, Midway. While Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes slashed into the American fleet, Thach led VF-3 Wildcats in defense of the carriers. He flew the maneuver as planned. Zeros came in fast, hunting the tail of one Wildcat. Thach barked the order, and the section turned. Tracers converged, and a Zero that had seemed untouchable seconds before erupted into pieces. Thach's after-action report would note the geometry with clinical brevity, but the lesson was electric. The Zero could be beaten, not by reflexes alone, but by doctrine. The Navy soon pulled Thach stateside to teach. He filmed, diagrammed, and lectured. He explained the weave again and again until young ensigns could fly it in their sleep. By the time American forces sailed south for the Solomons, the beam defense position was inked into kneeboards across the fleet. The Marines' seizure of the half-finished Japanese airstrip at Lunga Point on August 7th was the hinge on which the campaign turned. Within days it would be christened Henderson Field, and the ragged collection of Marine, Navy, and later Army Air Force squadrons that operated from it would be known as the Cactus Air Force. But in those first days, the field was little more than a scar of coral and packed earth. Construction crews worked under bombardment to lengthen it. Aircraft fuel arrived in drums rolled down from the beach. Bombs were stacked in the open, covered with palm fronds. At dawn, the jungle steamed with heat and malaria. At noon, engines coughed to life for the daily scramble. At dusk, everyone braced for another round of shellfire from Japanese cruisers lurking in Ironbottom Sound. Into this precarious foothold came Marine Fighting Squadron 223, VMF 223, and VMF 224, flying Wildcats ferried aboard the escort carrier Long Island. On August 20th, 1942, they lifted from the deck and landed at Henderson Field, the first fighter cover permanently based on the island. Their challenge was immense. From Rabaul, 560 miles away, Japanese twin-engine bombers, Mitsubishi G4M Bettys, could launch daily raids, escorted by Zeros of the 2nd and 5th Air Groups. The Marines had no radar at first, few spare parts, and pilots who had never fought in the tropics. What they did have was an idea. The first days were a blur of alarms. Tojo Time, the men called it, the predictable window each afternoon when the Bettys would arrive overhead. On August 20th itself, within hours of the first landing, VMF 223 scrambled to intercept. Captain John L. Smith led his division into the sun. What followed was chaos, Wildcats plunging through bomber formations, tracers flashing, Zeros spiralling in from above. When Smith landed, his score was already mounting, but for every victory the Marines paid dearly. Wildcats were slower, caught at the wrong altitude, they were meat on the table. And yet those who held formation, who trusted the weave, often returned. A Zero that glued itself to the tail of one Wildcat would suddenly find another bearing down at an oblique angle, 50 caliber Brownings hosing a 6-foot-wide convergence zone. The Japanese, used to scattering American formations with a single bounce, began to encounter pairs that refused to die. Naval history and heritage command records emphasize this moment. How a tactical diagram born of paper and matchsticks in 1941 was already filtering through the squadrons at Henderson by mid-August 1942. It was not yet called the Thach weave in their mouths, often just the two-plane defence or that beam turn, but the essence was unmistakable. For the men on Guadalcanal, this was not theory, it was life. Pilots slept under their wings, swatting mosquitoes, sweating through malaria pills, and then sprinted to cockpits at the sound of approaching engines. They learned quickly that soloists died. Those who stayed with their wingmen, who trusted the weave, lived to fly another scramble. The Wildcat was built for punishment. Its radial engine could soak up bullets the Zero could not. Its rugged construction, combined with disciplined use of Thach's tactic, tilted survival odds. One section could save each other even when both were slower than their enemy. In the days after August 20th, Henderson's defenders were few, the runways fragile, the enemy relentless. Yet the geometry held. A crossing turn here, a burst of Brownings there, and suddenly the Zero's aura of invincibility dimmed. Not destroyed, not yet, but dented in the crucible of cactus. John Thach himself was thousands of miles away by then, working in stateside training commands, drilling his manoeuvre into the next waves of aviators. He never set foot on Guadalcanal, but his voice carried there in doctrine, in diagrams, in the habits of men who had studied his reports and practiced his moves. That is the paradox of the Guadalcanal air campaign's opening phase. The man whose name would forever be attached to the weave did not fight there, but his tactic did, daily. Every time two Wildcats turned toward each other under the bright Pacific sun, every time a Zero pilot found himself flying into a net of converging tracers, Jimmy Thach's matchsticks were at work. By the end of August, the Cactus Air Force was bloodied but alive, Henderson Field still in American hands. The campaign was only beginning, and losses would be terrible, but already a shift was visible. The Zero was no longer an untouchable phantom. It was an airplane with weaknesses, and Americans had a tool to exploit them. A survival drill had become a doctrine had become a culture, and a culture was now lodged firmly in the air above Guadalcanal. The sound of engines carried across the jungle before the lookouts saw them. Long, steady drone of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, the sharper snarl of a 6M0s above. Each day the pattern repeated. Noon alarms, hurried scramble, Wildcats coughing black smoke as they clawed into the sky. The Marines on the ridges called it Tojo Time. To the men flying from Henderson Field, it was a daily equation of survival. VMF 223 and VMF 224 had arrived on August 20th, 1942. Their Wildcats ferried off the escort carrier Long Island. They rolled onto Henderson's coral strip barely finished, bulldozers still shoving wreckage to the side. There was no radar yet, just coast watcher warnings and sharp eyes. Fuel came from drums rolled by hand. Maintenance crews worked under palm fronds, sleeping beside the aircraft they kept alive. Within 24 hours of arrival, the squadrons were in combat. Captain John L. Smith, VMF 223's commanding officer, led the first sorties. His men went up in pairs, divisions, and squadrons, learning in seconds what training had only suggested. Altitude was life, teamwork was survival, and the Wildcat, though sluggish, could endure punishment the Zero could not. Smith's logbook began to fill with victories. His tactics and the manoeuvre already circulating through Navy ready rooms gave his men a chance to survive. On paper, the contest was cruelly unequal. The F4F Wildcat weighed nearly twice as much as a Zero, climbed slower, and turned like a truck. Its 6.50 caliber Brownings were potent but limited by ammunition and convergence settings. Against this stood the A6M2, fast, light, agile, and flown by veterans hardened since 1937. Yet the Wildcat had its virtues. It carried armour behind the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. Its radial engine could absorb punishment where the Zero's inline tankage turned hits into torchlight. And above all, when flown in pairs, the Wildcat could negate the Zero's favourite tactic, sliding onto a lone opponent's tail. This was the essence of the beam defence position, already whispered of as the Thach weave. Two Wildcats, wingtip to wingtip but offset, turned in toward each other at the moment of attack. The Zero had to commit. Chase won, and he presented his flank to the other. Break off, and the American pair reset, still alive. The manoeuvre turned the Wildcats' lack of agility into bait, buying time until Brownings could do their work. The first month was blood-soaked. Between August 20th and September 10th, VMF 223 and VMF 224 lost more than a dozen Wildcats, many pilots never escaping their cockpits. Some were caught climbing too slowly to intercept, others drawn into turning contests they could not win. But each loss taught something. Surviving pilots passed the lessons over tin cups in the revetments. Hold your wingman's position. Dive out if you must. Never dogfight at low altitude. John L. Smith enforced discipline with ferocity. If a man broke formation and lived, he heard about it on the ground. If he broke formation and died, his wingman remembered. In Smith's view, division integrity mattered more than individual flair. A section that stays together doubles its firepower, he told his pilots. A section that splits up dies in detail. First Lieutenant Marion Carl, already a veteran of Midway, emerged as one of Henderson's defining figures. Tall, serious, methodical, Carl absorbed the realities of combat faster than most. He understood the Wildcat's limits intimately and treated the weave not as a trick, but as a philosophy. His section flew tight, conserving altitude like gold, and turning only when the geometry promised advantage. Carl later recalled seeing Zero pilots commit themselves to a stern chase, only to find his wingman sliding across their nose with guns flashing. Many of those Japanese never had time to recover. Carl's victories mounted, eventually 18 on Guadalcanal, but he credited the tactic as much as his marksmanship. The Wildcat could not win alone, he admitted. It had to be flown in twos. Altitude discipline became the lifeblood of Henderson's defence. Wildcats scrambled hard to be above the Bettys before bomb release. If they failed, the runway was cratered, the revetments shredded, and every sortie thereafter more precarious. Once aloft, pilots tried to fight from the dive, not the climb. They learned to strike the bombers quickly and break away, trusting the weave only when the Zeros inevitably latched onto tails. Every afternoon, sortie meant gambling limited fuel and ammunition. Each Wildcat carried about 1,400 rounds, enough for less than 20 seconds of fire. Gunnery had to be precise, short bursts at convergence range. Here again, the weave mattered. By forcing an attacker into the cross, it offered fleeting, deadly snapshots at precisely the distances where .50 caliber rounds shredded unarmoured fuselages. The sea beneath the fights became Ironbottom Sound, named for the growing graveyard of ships. Above it, the sky filled daily with contrails, smoke and parachutes. Marines on the ground learned to read the fight by sound, the hollow whine of diving Wildcats, the sharper staccato of Zeros, the hammering chatter of Brownings. Some days, the air battle ended with wreckage tumbling into the sea and Bettys burning over the jungle. Other days, Wildcats limped home riddled with holes or failed to return at all. Yet by September, the balance, though fragile, was shifting. Losses remained high, but so did Japanese attrition. For every Wildcat destroyed, the Americans claimed multiple enemy bombers and fighters. More crucially, the aura of zero invincibility was fraying. Pilots who trusted the weave, who stayed in pairs, came home more often than those who tried to fight singly. What emerged in those weeks was not just a maneuver but a culture. Henderson pilots accepted that survival required obedience to formation, discipline in altitude, and trust in a wingman. Individual skill mattered, but not as much as coordination. Each sortie reinforced the point. Two planes together could achieve what one never could. By the end of September 1942, VMF 223 and VMF 224 were battered but still operational. Smith and Carl stood out as leaders, their squadrons adapting the beam defence under relentless pressure. Losses had written the doctrine in blood, but the lesson was clear. Over Ironbottom Sound, the Wildcat had found a way to fight. The blueprint was sketched in Thach's notebooks. Guadalcanal provided the ink, and the ink was red. The runway at Henderson was never quiet. Bulldozers scraped coral dust into the air, mechanics hammered out dents under palm leaf lean-tos, and ground crews rolled fuel drums by hand from supply dumps camouflaged under netting. At night, bomb craters were patched by lantern light. Every day brought a fresh tally of patched Wildcats, dented Dauntlesses, and new names scrawled on the squadron board with the grim annotation, missing. By late September 1942, the Cactus Air Force, a ragged coalition of Marine, Navy, and Army Air Force squadrons, was learning more than just survival. They were learning to strike back. The Japanese had not abandoned Guadalcanal. Reinforcements trickled down the Tokyo Express, fast destroyers that dashed down the slot under cover of night, unloading men and supplies before sunrise. Each daylight raid from Rabaul sought to bomb Henderson out of existence. Yet attrition was cutting both ways. The Zeros that once roamed with impunity were now facing opponents who understood their tricks. VMF 223 and VMF 224, though bloodied, had internalized the weave and drilled it into replacements. The fresh arrival of Navy Wildcats from the carrier Wasp, scuttled earlier in September, swelled the roster. Most important, the pilots of Cactus had begun to see patterns. The bombers always came in at altitude, the escorting Zeros weaving above and behind. If Wildcats could claw their way high enough before interception, they had the advantage of surprise. If they were caught low, the losses were savage. Every flight was a race between altitude and arrival. On September 27th, Marion Carl led one of the most decisive interceptions of the campaign. Coast watchers signalled a formation inbound, G4M Bettys with a heavy Zero escort. Carl gathered his division and climbed hard, engines straining in the humid air. At 20,000 feet, they intercepted the bombers head-on. Carl ignored the Zeros, focusing his Wildcats on the bomber formation. He had studied their approach patterns. Betty crews held tight defensive boxes, but one good burst could ignite their wing tanks. Diving through the formation, Carl and his wingmen flamed two bombers in seconds. Pulling into a shallow climb, he immediately signalled the weave, catching a pursuing Zero in the crossfire of his wingman's guns. The result was emblematic of a shift. The Wildcats were not just defending, They were dictating terms. Carl's combat report that evening noted 3 Bettys destroyed, 2 Zeros probable, with all his division returning. Henderson's strip had survived another day, not by luck, but by calculated aggression. Major John L. Smith, commanding VMF 223, was now a veteran with dozens of sorties. His face was hollowed by malaria and fatigue, but his presence kept discipline sharp. Smith insisted that every pilot think in terms of sections and divisions, not duels. The Wildcat is not a dueling sabre, he reminded them. It is a shield wall. You fight as a wall or you die one by one. On October 2nd, Smith personally led a division against another raid. His after-action debriefing, preserved in Marine Corps archives, described the encounter with mathematical precision. Range estimates, fuel burned, gunnery bursts measured in seconds. He claimed 2 victories that day, bringing his running total into double digits. By campaign's end, he would tally 19 confirmed, earning the Medal of Honor. But his greater legacy was the culture he set, discipline over instinct, patience over bravado. Each aerial clash unfolded over a sea already littered with wreckage. Sailors had begun to call it Ironbottom Sound, for the hulks that carpeted its depths. Pilots flying at 20,000 feet looked down and saw the glittering water punctuated by oil slicks and rising smoke. To them, the sea was both a warning and a promise. Fall from the sky, and it became a grave. Hold the sky, and it remained a shield for the Marines below. On October 9th, Japanese naval bombardments intensified. Battleships Congo and Haruna shelled Henderson with heavy guns, cratering the strip and igniting fuel dumps. At dawn, Wildcats clawed off the damaged runway to meet another incoming raid. Exhaustion gripped the pilots. Some had not slept more than 2 hours between alerts, but they went up anyway. The Marines on the perimeter listened to the rolling thunder above and knew the outcome of the campaign depended on the Cactus Air Force staying in the fight. Between September 27th and October 12th, the squadrons at Henderson refined their tactics. 5 principles emerged, written in grease pencil on briefing boards and hammered into young replacements. Stay in pairs. Division integrity was non-negotiable. Hold altitude. A Wildcat below a 0 was already dead. Dive, don't climb. Escape downward, not upward. Use short bursts. Ammunition was life. Spray was waste. Trust the weave. Never forget the geometry of survival. These rules, born of John Thach's matchstick sketches, became gospel at Guadalcanal. By the second week of October, even Japanese pilots noted in diaries and later interrogations that the Americans were harder to kill than before. The learning was paid in blood. On October 3rd, VMF 224 lost 3 Wildcats in a single engagement, ambushed while climbing too slowly. 1 pilot bailed out and was never seen again. Another ditched in the Sound, waving from his raft before disappearing. Each loss cut deeply. With replacements scarce, squadrons leaned heavily on a shrinking cadre of veterans. Malaria, dysentery and exhaustion claimed almost as many men as bullets. Pilots flew with fevers, mechanics worked half delirious, and ground crews slept beside revetments so they could wake instantly at the sound of incoming. Letters home, when they could be sent, carried little of this reality. Official communiques spoke of gallant defence, not of the smell of burned fuel or the sight of a comrade's chute failing to open. By October 12th, the Japanese High Command recognized that air parity over Guadalcanal was slipping. Losses were mounting, and the Zero's aura of dominance was eroding. The Cactus Air Force, though battered, was still functional, and every day Henderson remained operational meant more supplies and more Marines ashore. For the Americans, the realization was dawning that they could not only survive but impose costs. Wildcats might not outturn a 0, but flown in disciplined pairs, they could bleed the enemy white. Bombers that once cruised over Henderson with impunity were now shredded before they could release their loads. It was not yet victory. The Tokyo Express still ran nightly, Japanese artillery still pounded the airfield, and every sortie still risked annihilation. But for the first time since August, the men of VMF 223 and VMF 224 believed the tide might be shifting. Later histories would call this period the moment the Cactus Air Force transitioned from desperation to offence. The names of Marion Carl, John L. Smith, and their comrades became fixtures in marine aviation lore. Yet in those weeks, they were simply exhausted men flying tired machines from a cratered strip, holding back an enemy that refused to quit. The Wildcats remained outclassed on paper, but in the skies over Ironbottom Sound, paper statistics no longer told the whole story. Discipline, teamwork, and a borrowed tactic called the weave had begun to tilt the balance. By October 12th, the defenders of Guadalcanal had learned not just to endure, but to bite back. By mid-October, the battle for Guadalcanal had become a war of attrition in every sense, of men, of machines, of nerves. The Japanese knew Henderson Field was the hinge of the campaign. As long as the Cactus Air Force operated from that battered strip, Allied convoys could reinforce and supply the Marines. If Henderson fell silent, the island would be strangled. From Rabaul to Truk, planners funneled aircraft south in a last effort to crush the American foothold. For the men at Henderson, this meant weeks where each sunrise brought another test of endurance. On October 13th, the Japanese unleashed their heaviest blow yet. Battleships Congo and Haruna, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, closed the coast under cover of night. At 1:30, their 14-inch rifles began to thunder. For 80 minutes, Henderson Field endured one of the most violent naval bombardments of the Pacific War. Shells cratered the runways, ignited fuel dumps, and shattered aircraft where they sat in revetments. Fires illuminated the jungle as ground crews clawed desperately to drag planes from the flames. By dawn, at least 40 aircraft were destroyed or too damaged to fly. Yet by 900, after frantic repairs, Wildcats and Dauntlesses clawed into the air to intercept another bomber raid. The airstrip, though cratered, refused to die. Coast watcher Martin Clemens later noted in his diary, "The field looked finished in the morning, yet by noon it was alive again." These Americans, they are like ants rebuilding their hill no matter how often you kick it. On October 14th, Japanese army bombers struck again, this time escorted by a heavy screen of Zeros. Marine and Navy Wildcats rose to meet them, joined by Army Air Force P-40s and P-39s pressed into service. The fight lasted hours. The Zeros came down in waves, diving from 25,000 feet with sun advantage. Wildcats, often climbing too late, were forced into defensive weaves at lower altitude. Yet discipline held. Pilots paired off, trading shots, protecting each other's tails. Major John L. Smith claimed another Zero that day, describing in his report how his wingman's covering fire forced the Japanese pilot into his line of sight. "It was not my gunnery," Smith admitted. "It was the weave that killed him." Losses were heavy. By evening, Henderson's dispersal areas were littered with shot-up aircraft, some barely held together by canvas patches and wire. Pilots limped back with bullet holes stitched across wings and tails, landing on cratered runways that shook every rivet loose. Still, Henderson lived. For the Marines holding the perimeter, the constant air battles overhead were both a comfort and a torment. The comfort was knowing that friendly fighters still flew. The torment was the rain of bombs and artillery that continued despite them. At night, Japanese destroyers poured shells into the airfield. At dawn, Zeros prowled. During the day, Betty bombers droned overhead, occasionally slipping through the fighter screen. Every man on the island lived with a gnawing sense of exposure. Captain Joe Foss, newly arrived with VMF 121 in October, wrote home, "We never sleep. If the shelling doesn't wake you, the bombers will. The strip is cratered daily, yet somehow every morning the Wildcats go up again. I've never seen men work so hard or machines so stubborn. Foss would go on to become one of America's top aces, but in those first weeks he was simply another exhausted pilot thrown into the grinder. The battle extended beyond the skies. Each night, Japanese destroyers ran the gauntlet down the slot, landing troops and supplies. Each morning, Cactus aircraft hunted them. The waters of Ironbottom Sound grew ever more crowded with wreckage. On October 26th, during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the Cactus Air Force fought in concert with carrier groups offshore. Though the carriers Hornet and Enterprise bore the brunt, Henderson's fighters scrambled repeatedly to meet raids that threatened to overrun the Marines. By November, Ironbottom Sound was strewn with twisted hulks, Japanese and American alike. Pilots flying sorties at dawn often saw the water glittering with oil slicks, dotted with lifeboats and corpses. The war at Guadalcanal was as much a naval graveyard as an aerial battlefield. Despite constant losses, the tactical lessons hardened. The weave was now standard operating procedure. Pilots were drilled. Never fight alone, never chase a zero in a turn, dive for speed, climb only when safe. Marion Carl emphasized altitude discipline, reminding his men that to be caught climbing was to be caught dead. "Height is life," he wrote in his notebook, repeating words that would echo across marine aviation. Division integrity mattered more than ever. The two-plane section, often overlooked before the war, became sacred. Even green pilots knew, lose your wingman, and your odds of surviving dropped by half. The Japanese noticed. Interrogations after the war revealed that Zero pilots were frustrated by what they called the Americans' defensive circle. Where once lone Wildcats could be flanked and finished, now pairs fought as a unit. Attacks that once ended with quick kills now ended with Zeros forced to break off or face mutual crossfire. The Cactus Air Force paid dearly for every lesson. By November, VMF 223 and VMF 224 were shadows of their former selves. Pilots who had flown since August were gaunt, feverish, and visibly older. Many had not logged more than 4 or 5 hours of sleep in weeks. Replacements arrived, often with fewer than 10 hours in type, and were thrown straight into combat. Some never returned from their first mission. Others adapted quickly, absorbing doctrine in the most brutal classroom imaginable, the skies above Guadalcanal. The strain was evident in diaries. One mechanic scribbled, "We patch holes faster than they make them. Sometimes I think the planes are held together by hope and tape. But they fly, and that's all that matters." By early November, cracks were appearing in Japanese operations. Losses among veteran Zero units were mounting. The once unbeatable aura of the Mitsubishi fighter was fading. Pilots who had entered the campaign with supreme confidence now admitted in diaries that the Americans fight with strange persistence. The arrival of more F4F Wildcats, and soon the first F4U Corsairs, hinted at a future where Cactus would not just defend, but dominate. But in October and November 1942, dominance was still a dream. Survival itself was the victory. The Guadalcanal campaign's middle months were its bloodiest. Between October 13th and November 15th, Henderson Field endured near constant bombardment, aerial assault, and naval attack. Yet it never ceased operations for more than a few hours at a time. The Cactus Air Force, battered but unbroken, flew hundreds of sorties from a strip that should, by all logic, have been unusable. They did so not because they held superior aircraft. On paper, the Zero still outclassed the Wildcat, but because of discipline, doctrine, and the refusal to yield. John S. Jimmy. Thach was not at Henderson during these months, yet his weave was. Born from matchsticks on a kitchen table, tested in classroom diagrams, it had become the lifeline of every Marine and Navy pilot who clawed into the skies over Ironbottom Sound. The longest days were not measured only in hours of combat or shells fired. They were measured in endurance, the sheer grinding will to keep flying when logic said the strip should be silent, the planes grounded, the island lost. Instead, Henderson lived, and with it, the chance for eventual victory in the Pacific. The November nights at Guadalcanal burned with thunder. Japanese battleships and cruisers poured shells into Henderson Field, determined to smash it once and for all. The Marines called it simply the Big One, a final effort by the Imperial Navy to sweep the Americans into the sea. For 4 days, the fate of the campaign, and perhaps the Pacific, hung over that battered airstrip. On November 12th, coast watchers reported a massive Japanese force steaming down the slot. At Henderson, every pilot knew what it meant: another night of fire. That evening, cruisers and destroyers clashed in Ironbottom Sound in a battle so close that sailors saw the faces of their enemies in muzzle flashes. Both sides lost ships, but the Japanese bombardment fell short of its aim. Henderson, cratered again, still functioned by dawn. The following night, November 13th, the battleships Hiei and Kirishima attempted to repeat October's devastation. Instead, they met desperate American cruisers at point-blank range. Shells and torpedoes tore both sides apart, but Henderson was spared annihilation. Ground crews worked through darkness, filling craters, patching fuel lines, and rolling aircraft onto makeshift strips. By November 14th, the Cactus Air Force struck back with everything it had left. Dauntlesses, Avengers, and Wildcats launched in waves against Japanese transports and their escorts. Joe Foss led divisions of Wildcats through zero screens, claiming multiple kills and cementing his reputation as America's new ace. The results were devastating. Allied bombers and fighters tore into troop transports approaching Guadalcanal. 4 were sunk outright, others left blazing. Survivors clung to debris, many never reaching shore. For the first time, Japanese reinforcements failed to deliver their full strength. The night of November 14th to 15th was the campaign's climax. Japanese battleships again attempted to silence Henderson. This time, they were met by Admiral Willis Lee's task force of battleships Washington and South Dakota. In the black waters of Ironbottom Sound, radar-directed gunfire shredded Kirishima, sending her to the bottom. For once, American battleships stood their ground and prevailed. At dawn, Henderson's aircraft launched to finish the job. Wildcats provided cover as Dauntlesses dove onto crippled transports. By noon, 7 of 11 Japanese troopships lay sunk or burning. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned or were stranded without supplies. For Cactus pilots, the days blurred into exhaustion and adrenaline. Many flew 4 or 5 sorties in a single day, refueling from hand-pumped drums, rearming under shell fire. Pilots returned with bullet holes in wings, landing gear half-functional, engines coughing smoke. Some never returned at all. On the ground, Marines sheltered in foxholes as naval shells rained down. They emerged to see their airfield cratered, only to watch mechanics and Seabees fill holes and drag patched Wildcats into place. It was like watching resurrection, one infantryman wrote. By morning, the strip was alive again, and the planes went up as if nothing had happened. By November 15th, it was clear. The Japanese assault had failed. Henderson still stood. The Tokyo Express, bled by air attacks and denied decisive naval victory, could no longer deliver enough men or supplies. The battle for Henderson Field marked the turning point, not just of the Guadalcanal campaign, but of the Pacific War. The Japanese had thrown battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and their most experienced aviators into the effort. They had silenced the airfield with shells, only to see it reborn with the dawn. Against them stood exhausted Marines, patched-together Wildcats, and the stubborn geometry of the Thach weave. For John S. Jimmy. Thach, far away training new pilots, it was vindication. His memo pad sketch, born of desperation in 1941, had become a doctrine that saved squadrons and preserved Henderson Field. In the crucible of November 1942, that doctrine helped ensure the Allies would hold Guadalcanal and begin the long push westward. By December 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal had entered a new phase. The desperate days of October and November, the naval bombardments, the endless bomber raids, the cratered airfield that refused to die, were past. Henderson Field still bore the scars, but its very survival had changed the balance of power in the Pacific. For the first time, the Americans were not just enduring. They were beginning to dictate the tempo of the campaign. The relief came in waves. New Wildcats arrived, along with the first handful of F4U Corsairs. Fresh pilots, drawn from stateside training squadrons, joined veterans who had flown since August. Ground crews received more tools, spare parts, and proper workshops. Henderson's runways were extended, its dispersal areas widened, and revetments reinforced with sandbags and steel. Most important was logistics. In December, Allied convoys arrived in daylight, escorted by fighters that now dominated the skies. Supplies no longer came by stealth or miracle. They came in openly, proof that Guadalcanal was no longer a besieged outpost, but a fortress. The Japanese were still dangerous. Raids from Rabaul continued, and the Tokyo Express did not cease its nightly runs. But the quality of opposition was slipping. Veteran Zero pilots, lost in the meat grinder of September and November, were being replaced by hastily trained youngsters. Their tactics were predictable, their formations looser, and their nerves thinner. The Wildcat, once dismissed as inferior, was now flown with discipline honed by months of combat. Pilots knew its strengths: armor, dive speed, and the weave. Against inexperienced Japanese flyers, those strengths multiplied. American kill ratios began to climb. Where August had seen near parity in losses, December brought reports of 3, 4, even 5 Japanese aircraft falling for each Wildcat lost. No figure embodied the transformation more than Captain Joe Foss. Arriving in October, he quickly adapted to Henderson's brutal rhythm. By January 1943, Foss had scored 26 confirmed kills, equaling Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. His method was textbook: altitude advantage, tight division discipline, and cold efficiency with the trigger. Foss was not alone. Pilots like John L. Smith, Marion Carl, and Kenneth Walsh pushed their tallies upward. These men were not reckless hunters. They were professionals applying a system. Their example drilled into replacements the value of teamwork over individual glory. By January, the Cactus Air Force was doing more than defending Henderson. Wildcats and Dauntlesses ranged farther afield, striking Japanese positions on neighboring islands and harassing Tokyo Express runs. Bombers, escorted by fighters, could now target enemy shipping with increasing impunity. The shift was psychological as much as material. Marines on the ground noticed fewer bombs falling on their foxholes. Supply dumps grew instead of dwindling. For the first time, the men at Guadalcanal could imagine not just surviving the campaign, but winning it outright. The months of struggle had forged a permanent change in American air doctrine. The weave, once a speculative classroom idea, was now embedded in every squadron's training. The two-plane section was sacred. Altitude discipline was drilled into every pilot. Captured Japanese reports after the war confirmed the impact. Diaries spoke of the American Circle, of frustration at Wildcats that refused to fight alone, of machine guns that poured fire in unbroken streams. The aura of the Zero had been pierced, its dominance undone by a combination of steel, discipline, and relentless adaptation. By February 1943, the Japanese High Command conceded reality. The evacuation of Guadalcanal began in secrecy, cloaked as reinforcement runs. When American patrols discovered the truth weeks later, Henderson's pilots realized they had done more than hold a strip of coral and mud. They had broken Japan's offensive momentum. The battle for Guadalcanal had begun with desperation and ended with superiority. In those 6 months, American naval aviation had grown from fragile infancy to hardened maturity. The Cactus Air Force, its name borrowed from a simple code word, had proven that doctrine, discipline, and sheer endurance could turn survival into victory. When the last Japanese troops slipped away from Guadalcanal in February 1943, the Americans inherited not only a scarred island, but also a hard-won doctrine. The Cactus Air Force's fight had validated John S. Jimmy Thach's matchstick sketch, proving that disciplined geometry could defeat the feared zero. From that crucible, the weave spread across the Pacific like a secret code finally shouted aloud. The Grumman F4F Wildcat had carried the fight through 1942, but its successor was already on the horizon. The F6F Hellcat, heavier, faster, and armed with the same 6.50 caliber guns, entered frontline service in the summer of 1943. Pilots transitioning from Wildcats brought their doctrine with them. Naval Air Training Command made the Thach weave a standard maneuver in flight school. What began as a survival tactic was now a core part of curriculum, drilled until automatic. Student pilots learned to trust the geometry. Two planes weaving in opposition, covering arcs of fire that no pursuer could penetrate safely. The Hellcat, with its better climb rate and speed, made the tactic deadlier. Against the same zero that had once terrorized the Pacific, the new American fighter, flown in pairs, was a hunter, not prey. In November 1943, the great air assaults on Rabaul put the doctrine to the test on a massive scale. Hundreds of carrier-launched Hellcats clashed with Zeros over the Japanese stronghold. After-action reports repeatedly noted the success of beam defense positions. One squadron leader from the USS Essex summarized, "We no longer tell green pilots to fight like aces. We tell them, stay with your wingman, hold your weave, and the enemy will come to you. It is mathematics, not bravado." The results were staggering. Over Rabaul, Hellcat pilots claimed more than 200 victories for minimal losses. Post-war records suggest Japanese attrition was nearly that severe. The weave was no longer a desperate trick. It was the backbone of American air superiority. The spread of the weave reshaped squadron culture. Where once the image of the lone ace had dominated, the Navy and Marine Corps now championed the section. Kill credits were shared, missions debriefed in terms of teamwork. The weave rewarded discipline over individuality, geometry over instinct. Pilots themselves embraced it. The memory of Guadalcanal's early losses was still raw, and few wished to repeat them. A young Hellcat pilot, interviewed after the Marianas battles, said simply, "I don't care who fires the burst. As long as the enemy falls, the weave worked." The doctrine reached its zenith in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese carrier aviation, already depleted of veterans, hurled wave after wave of aircraft at American fleets. Hellcats, flying in disciplined pairs and fours, met them with overlapping fields of fire. Many Japanese pilots, barely trained, dove straight into the crossfire of weaving sections. The results were catastrophic. More than 300 Japanese planes destroyed in a single day, at the cost of only a few dozen American aircraft. Historians later noted that the weave was not the sole cause of this lopsided slaughter. Radar direction, superior numbers, and pilot training all played roles. But the tactic remained central. In countless engagements, it was the weave that transformed raw American flyers into coordinated teams capable of overwhelming their opponents. By 1945, the Thach weave had become synonymous with U.S. naval air power. It was taught in manuals, scribbled on briefing boards, and remembered in the logbooks of thousands of pilots who credited it with their survival. For Jimmy Thach himself, who spent much of the later war commanding training groups and carrier task forces, the greatest vindication was hearing from pilots he had never met. Letters and after-action reports reached him from across the Pacific. "Used your weave today. Got home alive." The tactic had begun as a sketch over a kitchen table, an answer to the riddle of the zero. On Guadalcanal, it became a lifeline. In the Central Pacific, it became doctrine. By war's end, it was part of the very fabric of naval aviation. By the war's closing months in 1945, the Thach weave was no longer just a tactic. It was an institution, woven into the identity of American naval aviation. What had been a classroom sketch in 1941 had carried men through Guadalcanal, Rabaul, the Marianas, and Okinawa. It survived the transition from Wildcats to Hellcats, from propellers to jets, and from crisis to victory. In the spring of 1945, the largest carrier armada in history struck Okinawa. The Japanese response was desperate. Kamikaze attacks launched in waves from Kyushu. Though the weave had been designed to counter agile fighters, its geometry still proved useful. Hellcat and Corsair sections, flying mutual defense, created overlapping arcs that made it harder for lone kamikazes to penetrate. Pilots noted that the discipline of flying the weave, always watching for one's wingman, always holding formation, was invaluable against suicide attackers, who often appeared suddenly and dove without hesitation. The tactic did not prevent every strike, but it preserved carriers long enough for the U.S. Navy to endure one of its bloodiest campaigns. When peace came, American and Japanese veterans alike reflected on the change Guadalcanal had wrought. At reunions and interrogations, former Zero pilots admitted their frustration at facing disciplined pairs of Wildcats. "We could outturn them," one recalled, "but we could not outfight the circle." American veterans spoke with equal conviction. Many credited the weave not just with saving lives, but with teaching a generation of pilots that survival depended on cooperation. The age of the lone ace, they believed, had ended. In 1962, at a U.S.-Japanese aviation history symposium, several surviving Marine aces described Guadalcanal. When asked what turned the tide, they gave a unanimous answer: discipline, sections, and the weave. John S. Jimmy. Thach never returned to Guadalcanal, but his influence spread far beyond it. Promoted steadily, he commanded carrier task forces in the later Pacific campaigns and remained in the Navy after the war. By the 1960s, he had risen to four-star admiral, shaping Cold War naval aviation as profoundly as he had shaped its wartime infancy. In interviews, Thach downplayed personal credit. "Any pilot with a pencil could have drawn it," he said of his weave. Yet his humility masked its impact. Thousands of pilots lived because he had anticipated the Zero's advantages before ever meeting it in combat. With the dawn of jet aircraft, some wondered if the weave had outlived its usefulness. Speeds doubled, engagements stretched over greater distances, and missiles replaced machine guns. Yet the fundamental principle, mutual support through geometry, remained. U.S. Navy and Air Force manuals of the 1950s still emphasized section tactics derived from the weave. Even as technology shifted, the idea that two aircraft could cover each other's blind spots endured. At reunions of Guadalcanal veterans in the 1980s, aging Marines and sailors remembered the smell of burning avgas, the nightly shellings, and the exhaustion of those months. They also remembered the sight of Wildcats in the sky, weaving back and forth, holding off Zeros that had once seemed unstoppable. One Marine infantryman summed it up. "We thought they were crazy, flying those stubby little planes against the Zeros. Then we watched them come home, again and again. The weave kept Henderson alive, and Henderson kept us alive." At the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, a Wildcat stands restored beside a placard explaining the Thach weave. Its wings are patched, its paint scarred. Beneath it, in faded letters from a captured Japanese diary, the enemy's grudging epitaph: "The Americans do not fight alone. They fight as two, and as two they cannot be beaten." From a kitchen table sketch to the skies over Guadalcanal, from battered Wildcats to jet-age doctrine, the Thach weave left a mark that outlasted the war itself. It was not glamorous, it was not acrobatic, but it was enduring. And in that endurance lay its power. In the longest days of 1942, It had turned survival into possibility. By 1945, it had helped turn possibility into victory.